Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War News Update, third part thereof for the 21st of November 2024. Let's get to some geopoliticking. We're going to start with Viktor Orban, our good friend from Hungary. So, what do we have here? Orban's government has unilaterally introduced new gerrymandered election districts in Budapest and the Pest country. Experts note that the changes are designed to undermine the rising TISA party's chances. Budapest mayor calls it retaliation as the capital votes against Orban. Kyiv says with support for Orban's Putin-loving regime collapsing, they aim to further rig the game. This is exactly what we expect from autocratic regimes, which is okay, when it's looking like we are going to get ousted from a democratic vote, then we rig the election, gerrymander the districts and make sure that we don't lose a supposedly democratic election. That's an absolute shocker there, but completely unsurprising. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban said, quote, "The 500-year era of dominance of Western civilization is over. The centre of the world economy has shifted to the east and the next century will be the century of Eurasia." And it makes you wonder why the conservative landscape in the US really like Viktor Orban. He's basically trashing the US, or at least saying, no, it is no longer the US. You won't be the top of the global hegemony. And arguably, that is why the US shouldn't be isolating itself like it looks like it will. You've got to be in it to win it, essentially. If you want to be the number one power structure in the world, then you have to thrust yourself into global machinations. That's the word I was looking for. Okay, we've just seen, well, maybe you haven't, but I've just seen Emmanuel Macron, the French president, speak to the Chileans here. Chile has shown the way, and I call on all the leaders of your continent to take up the torch of the Libertadores and support these freedom fighters. I want to reiterate to the Ukrainian people that we stand with them. This is a great opportunity taken here by Macron and shows that Ukraine is so important to Macron. It is really important to the EU, to global security, to economic security, and very important, obviously, to Europe as a whole. Now, he is taking these ideas to the South Americans, in this case Chile, but you can imagine there would be very many countries in South America that we would appreciate if they supported Ukraine more openly. I'm looking at Brazil here, to be perfectly frank. But yeah, it shows the importance of Ukraine to Macron, and shows that there is a need for the global south to be invested in supporting Ukraine. But anyway, there you go. Let's move on. We're going to now go to Belarus, a Belarusian who fought... Oh, yeah, so actually there's a connection here. So this is a kind of global south, or places outside of Western, like capital W, Western centres of the world. So the US, Europe, and you could argue Australia, Japan. Here we have Vietnam. So Belarusian who fought for Ukraine has been extradited from Vietnam to Belarus. Vasil Vramichik, a former soldier of the Kalinowski regiment fighting on Ukraine's side, was extradited from Vietnam to Belarus last week, according to Zakharova. That is a real shame. He now faces imprisonment as the Kalinowski regiment was recently declared a terrorist organisation by the Supreme Court of Belarus. More examples of how the Belarusian government, or the Belarusian dictator Lukashenko, is beholden to his Russian overlord. Okay, now we're going to move on to the intercontinental ballistic missile, or intermediate range ballistic missile, depending on who you listen to. Lots of raging debates about this. Shashank Joshi says, I note that that Defence Intel explicitly described RS-26, that's supposedly the missile that was launched, as an ICBM in its reports just a few years ago. So it's interesting now that you're hearing all these claims that it's not an ICBM. DIA's report in 2024 on nuclear challenges said that the RS-26 remains in development and is probably suffering from delays. If that missile was shot, then it might have been an ICBM, it might have been an IRBM. I'm not overly bothered. I mean, it's a nuclear capable missile, and we can wonder whether it get all the way to the US or not. But it's still an interesting move from the Russians there. Now, Tyler Rogaway says a couple of things on the Russian MIRV ballistic missile. So what we do know about or what seems apparent from the footage that we have is that there were multiple warheads that came out. Whether they were actually warheads or rods or weight simulators is open to debate. But it's an MIRV ballistic missile. Strike on Ukraine. If the US did not have clear intelligence or warning prior to the launch of the missile of its intent and payload, it would have set off a very concerning chain of events at Stratcom that rippled throughout the DoD strategic architecture. There is a standard alert procedure when anything that could be a threat is launched. But this was an unprecedented act that would have played out uniquely, as it did indeed strike a target area of an allied nation end to end, as opposed to a test. It's quite possible, if not probable, that the US had detailed intelligence of the intent of the launch prior to it. Russia warning the US as to the nature of the launch is also quite possible. Still, it would have been monitored and treated as a threat. With no warning, the missile would have been detected immediately during boost by space-based infrared warning platforms, SBIRS, etc., and it would have been tracked by multiple additional sensor systems during mid-course. Aegis ashore in Europe, assuming it was operating normally, could have been a key asset here. It isn't clear what intelligence, if any, was available the US shared with Ukraine about the use of the weapon left or right of launch. Bottom line is that there is another story here about how America's strategic architecture dealt with this event, and that story likely played out in a unique way based on any intelligence or communications prior to the launch. Adversary test launches are not uncommon, and they too can trigger standard operating practices that look the same as a real attack. But this is a unique event and exactly what the US knew about it and when is key to how it all played out. Hopefully we'll find out more in this regard in the coming hours, days, and so on. Now, interesting, I mentioned this morning, I wasn't sure whether it actually happened, but it appears to have happened. It's being reported by mainstream media. Russian spokeswoman got a call, so Maria Zakharova got a call to telling her to shut up during a live TV briefing. So this is with regard to the launch of the ballistic missile, and she was basically called and said, don't talk about this, as you can see from this video. She takes the call. And yes, hello, she says. Hello, Mash. Yes, I'm at a briefing. That's her name, Mash. About the ballistic missile strike on Yuzmash, the Western media are talking about. We are not commenting at all. Oh, yes, okay, thank you. Bye. Okay, so that's that. So asked not to comment at all. I just thought it was interesting. She was interrupted in her press briefing. And if there are any questions on that, you ain't saying jack. Shashank Joshi again says, oh, interesting here. So we have a national security advisor official tells NPR that Russia launched an experimental medium range ballistic missile. So there are all these arguments, as mentioned, about whether it's an ICBM or an IRBM, and now it seems that there's this rumor that it's an experimental medium range ballistic missile. But again, Putin has come out and spoken on television. First appearance since, I believe, November the 7th, which is 2 weeks ago. Interesting one there. He began an emergency address to the Russian people regarding the use of the long-range weapons on Russian territory. First statements: the conflict has acquired elements of a global character. Russian military facilities in Bryansk and Kursk regions were struck by Western missiles on November the 19th. 6 ATACMS missiles, and on November the 21st, Storm Shadow missiles struck facilities in Kursk and Bryansk regions. Russia struck Yuzmash with a nuclear-free hypersonic ballistic missile. Ukraine was struck by the newest ballistic hypersonic missile, Oreshnik. Interesting. that he deems this as important enough to come out of his bunker and give his opinion on them. A bit more from this. The latest Russian missile strike targets at a speed of 2 to 3 kilometers per second, and the enemy's existing missile defense systems are unable to intercept them. The responsibility for the escalation lies with, of course, the US. The US made a mistake by violating the agreement to eliminate long-range missiles. They have moved their missile systems into various regions around the world. Of course, this is absolute nonsense. What has been happening is that Russia has been throwing hypersonic missiles from very long distances inside Russia into Ukraine, right across Ukraine, from the western reaches of Ukraine to the eastern, from the northern to the southern, Odessa, Kiev, Lviv, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv. They've been hammered. Civilian infrastructure has been hammered with every type of missile that the Russians have, apart from these kind of intercontinental, intermediate range ballistic missiles. So to think that there's any kind of escalation involved with Ukraine doing to Russia what Russia have done to Ukraine is ridiculous. That's like saying to Doris, so Doris, you're mugging Doris, right? And you're beating her up, you've broken her arms, and you're just pummeling her with your greatest strength. She gets out pepper spray, sprays you in the eyes, and you're like, Doris, you've escalated this. I can't believe you've escalated this. Now I'm gonna, hang on, you've just broken my arms. Like, I'm not escalating this, I'm defending myself. I wouldn't be pepper spraying you in the eyes if you hadn't attacked me, if you hadn't broken my arms. So the idea that this is escalation is just overt nonsense. The defender can't, when they're fighting for their lives, it cannot do things that are escalatory. The Russians are responsible for this war. De-escalation happens when they get out of Ukraine. Anyway, Putin carries on. In case of escalation, Russia will respond decisively and mirror the actions. So this is what Ukraine is doing, is mirroring the actions, but they're not allowed to mirror the actions. Russia's allowed to mirror Ukraine's actions, but Ukraine's not allowed to mirror the Russian actions. It's absolutely ridiculous. But the problem is there are certain people around the world who will buy this. You need to call them out. We need to call them out. Whenever you hear it, call it out. Russia will offer civilians in Ukraine and citizens of other friendly countries the opportunity to leave potential strike zones in advance, Putin stated. Whatever. Putin has been playing nuclear gamble all along since the start of the full invasion of Ukraine. Such attacks as the one this morning is yet another sign of Putin's escalation, showing he is not interested in peace, said the EU spokesperson Peter Stano. And that's the right kind of approach, which is this escalation is Putin's escalation. Now, Gustav Gressel, who is, I believe, an Austrian, I think he's Austrian, military expert. He's a former serving member of the armed forces. Anyway, I was going to interview him once, but I never got around to it actually. I might have contacted him on Twitter, but I don't think he replied. Anyway, we had an Ostausschuss recording yesterday, and today my voice is gone. I can't give interviews, but I can type something here. So, on the supposed ICBM launch and the escalation panic, this is exactly what Moscow wanted to achieve, but is it justified? First, the situation is a result of the unwise and stupid policy of red line notification by the Biden administration. I've talked about this before, where we in the West have laid out our own red lines, crossed them, and then Russia has taken those red lines as being written because we wrote them, and it says, oh, you crossed that red line, now things are going to get funky. It's like we were the ones that restricted ourselves and restricted Ukraine by falsely manufacturing our own red lines. What do I mean by that? To extensively debate and draw limits on the support for Ukraine to avoid escalation. This gave Moscow's saber rattling more credibility than it should have. Had they stuck, we will assist Ukraine within the boundaries of international law and what we see as necessary, everything would be possible and permitted, but nothing promised up front. We would have been flexible. This is the idea, and this is perfectly put, actually. This is the idea that strategic ambiguity is what you need, and you just say, by the way, we will respond to you as fully as we can within the remit of international law. However that will be, I'm not going to tell you exactly, but we will, and for allies of Ukraine. It's we will assist Ukraine within the and up to the boundaries of international law. And that's not what has been said and done. What has been said and done has been like, oh, we'll create some red lines that we imagine Russia would think are in place, and we'll paint those red lines on the ground, and then we'll just walk up to those red lines and we won't go past those red lines. Yeah, but international law says we can go past those red lines. It's only you that's painted those red lines. Yeah, but I'm a little bit nervous. Yeah, but you look at previous behaviour of Russia, is that justified? Are you justified in being as nervous and painting these red lines, painting ourselves into a corner here through, Red Line City? Nukes. Okay. So the Biden-Schultz tandem started to introduce red lines that were unsuitable on the day that they were announced. Bosh. And Moscow had great fun playing with it. They enjoyed this game to the day. Crossing the red line, the scare quotes red line, that became a political fuzz on tanks, fighters, whatever. This time the Russians started to cross lines, namely by introducing Korean soldiers. The US warned there would be implications, and then they had to be. Allowing Ukraine to strike at targets with an operative relationship to Kursk, where North Korean soldiers are taking part in combat operations, is a clear signal that this is aimed at containing the North Korean role. However, Moscow in advance signaled that they would add consequences to strikes inside Russia, so they had to be. Moscow went almost hysterical, talking about NATO's entry into war and such like. So compared to what they threatened, of course, the consequences now are fairly modest. They have to be limited because they can't afford more assertive reactions, regardless how pissed they are. I will not add speculations on the system fired at Dnipro tonight, but certainly something larger than systems previously used. However, it seems test RVs came down with no significant damage. Conventional missiles and drones rain down death at a larger scale each week and day. Keep calm. That's a really good point, actually, that everyone's talking about escalation here, but this missile did far less damage than we've seen from conventional, supposedly more de-escalated or further down the escalation ladder munitions. Also note the warning of a major air attack by embassies yesterday, causing their closure. I would highly suspect launch notification was given, still waiting confirmation though, as we still run within the usual management of strategic stability. For Moscow, staying within these limits is not trivial. Its army is bogged down in Ukraine. Those units left in Russia are conducting training of recruits and volunteers. They are not ready for operational deployment. Russia has used up large parts of its conventional long-range strike arsenal on Ukraine. Both are important instruments for escalation control in case of a wider confrontation with NATO. And now they are not available in the quantity and quality needed for the task. Biden has threatened to enter US conventional firepower to the war in Ukraine if Russia used nukes. Putin may try to test Biden as a lame duck, but has to be very careful because any substantial reaction from DC will make him lose the war. Also, Russian economic lifelines, like China, I think that's what that means, would be displeased, threatening a Russian war effort. And a symbolic release will not make Russia win. Strike at NATO would be even more catastrophic for Russia under the current circumstances because the army that was intended to fight NATO is still fighting elsewhere, and for a reason Russia tries to harm NATO with all means way below Article 5 threshold: cables, sabotage, cyber, migration, you name it. They will continue to play the nuclear fear in the West, do whatever helps to keep nuclear fear up. I actually expected a nuclear test rather than an IRBM or something into Ukraine, but not risk real escalation. Unfortunately, Biden-Schultz gave them every reason to believe it works. So that's his assessment. We have Ruth Diamond saying, I agree strongly with Fabian Hoffman's view that this strike, quote, this strike is not for military value. This is purely for political purpose. It's the kind of signalling you engage in when you can't, in fact, escalate in the way you've been threatening. I thought this was interesting because I said earlier on this morning in the breaking news update that use of ballistic missile was all they could do. There's no real space, I've said this before, there's no real space other than maybe chemical warfare in the escalation game. So when you are, between where the Russians are now and nuclear war, so when you're saying, oh, don't do that or what? The or what is, or we're not going to do nukes, or chemical warfare would be we're getting loads of trouble and everyone would go mad about that. So, or okay, what missile can we throw at them? There's a little bit more than what we're already doing. Oh, that really big one that is a bit experimental. Yeah, it's got just these rods in it. We're not really sure if it works properly. Yeah, I know that one. Yeah, we can lob that at them. Let's do that. Still, that's not a nuke, is it? But it can carry nuke, and that might give them the right shits. Okay, let's do that. Boom, 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 boom. Yeah, that's all they can do to keep face here. So yeah, if confirmed, the launch of the Russian ICBM against Ukraine would have virtually no military value, says Fabian Hoffman. Yeah, I tend to agree. Now, the Army Corps General Michel Yakovlev in France has said, technically speaking, the next real step that would change the course of the war is a NATO no-fly zone on Ukrainian territory against direct Russian attack. My mate, I was down a pub the other night, my mate was like, do you know what? I think I was right about the NATO no-fly zone at the beginning of the war. Had they done it, it wouldn't have been escalatory. And, compared to where we are now 3 years later, etc., etc. And actually, I think history might look back at the calls for a NATO fly zone and I guess you could make a really good argument that it would be fully justified at the time. Now, Zaluzhny, who's now the UK ambassador, said, we can assume that the Third World War has already begun. This is exactly my point I gave when it gave a talk on this in Stockbridge, to which some of you came. Thank you very much. Quote, Ukraine is no longer facing a neighbour. Ukraine is facing soldiers from North Korea, Iranian Shahids, North Korean-made missiles, Chinese shells that strike in Ukraine. Chinese parts are used in Russian missiles, he said. And then when you take that on to hybrid warfare and the involvement of all of Ukraine's allies together with Ukraine in this war, I think this is indeed the Third World War. Now, Ilya Ponomarenko says, note that Putin has not appeared in public since November the 7th, although he has now today. And Russian state propaganda is actively replaying archival footage of his less recent appearances. Meanwhile, Western-supplied Ukrainian missiles are striking military targets on Russian territory, and the Kremlin's useful idiots on social media are once again howling about a World War III while Putin seems to have vanished. This is precisely what happens to Russia every time things go badly. Inept appeasers always assume that Putin will respond reciprocally. They think he'll flash his homoerotic bare torso and show the world what a macho strongman he is. Instead, every time what happens is exactly what you would expect when a cocky street thug gets a solid punch to the face and lands on his ass. Putin retreats and disappears from public eye to avoid being associated with humiliation and weakness. Later, he does everything he can to pretend nothing special happened, appearing on TV to open honey fairs or similar trivial events. This happened when the Russian army was routed near Kiev, Kharkiv and Kherson. And this is what happened after the sinking of the Black Sea Fleet's flagship, after drone strikes on the Kremlin, and initially after the Wagner mutiny. Our cocky big guy Tsar tucks his tail between his legs and slinks away as soon as he takes a gut punch. And this is exactly what escalation managers stubbornly refuse to see and understand. You don't escalate the war by helping Ukraine. You escalate it when you make it clear that to the cowardly thug that you are weak, that you fear him, and that you want to appease him. When you signal that, you would rather let Ukraine bleed out than allow Putin to be driven into retreat. That's why we still have this terrible war. It's the idea that Putin really thrives on weakness, and that's kind of escalatory. You show yourself to be weak, Putin will just take more and more and more. You need to stand up and be strong. Well, actually, Ukraine have done that. Now, in this case, actually, Putin has come out and said something on television, but it's arguably the usual kind of bluster. It'll be interesting to see if anything comes of it. It's going to be fascinating to see what happens in the sort of public conversation in America. Now, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has publicly called on Putin to get out of Ukraine during the G20 summit in Brazil just recently. For the third year running, Putin did not attend this summit, and on day 1,000 of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, I say again, end the war, get out of Ukraine.
The third year running, Putin.
So there is that. Okay, so now we move on. I've got a new computer set up, and that all was a bit funky there. Right, I've sorted that out now. Let's listen to Keir.
We will work with partners across the G20, but one nation stands apart. For the third year running, Putin did not attend this summit. He is the author of his own exile. And on day 1,000 of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, I say again, end the war, get out of Ukraine. We will work with...
Good stuff indeed, get out of Ukraine. Now, I think Poland are manoeuvring themselves into a very important position within Europe and indeed within the world, especially considering the war in Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced a meeting in Sweden next week with the participation of the Scandinavian and Baltic countries, where they will discuss the West's need for a unified position on supporting Ukraine. And then we hear this. So Edward Hunter Christie, well, first of all, we'll go to ECFR, saying that Poland has done its homework in the areas that matter to Trump. As such, Duda, so he's a prime minister, he's a president, not the prime minister. Duda is from the PIS party, different to Tusk. Duda extending the offer of a Poland visit to Trump means one Donald may well welcome the other with open arms. Writes Marta Provich, something like that. Lots of letters that I find difficult when they're close to each other. Now, I think that is interesting that Trump has been offered to Poland. Duda he was on national television in the US bigging up Trump before the election. He's much more Duda of the kind of right-wing populist stance of Trump, whereas Donald Tusk is somewhat different. But Poland could well be super important. Edward Hunter Christie says, indeed, Poland has done everything to become an important security provider and to bind the United States to its defense through exemplary actions and investments. So what's worth knowing as well is that Poland is one of those nations that sits above the US in terms of percentage of GDP spent on defense. They have been spending inordinate amounts of money over the last kind of decade, certainly the last few years, on defense, buying an awful lot of kit. So Poland are setting a really good example to the US as a European nation who are definitely paying their way. Now, quote from the Foreign Minister Sybiha here of Ukraine: Ukraine will not accept any peace proposals that provide for compromise on territories and sovereignty. So lots of messages coming out from both Ukraine and Russia at the moment that they will not compromise. They will not have negotiations unless basically they get what they want. Both sides are obviously going to say that, and that's where it's at. Now, the Five Eyes intelligence group is to meet in Japan for the first time. Why is this important? So Five Eyes is the intelligence organization, or I think organization is too much of a formal word, although it is formal, but it's the intelligence network of the US, UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and it's called Five Eyes. And I guess there's the advantage of being all English speaking, and that gives you a much smoother intelligence connectivity, but it's also thought that these are the nations who aren't going to do like a Hungary, they're not going to do a Slovakia, they're going to be pretty safe. Now, having a Five Eyes intelligence group meeting in Japan, when Japan aren't even members of Five Eyes, signifies the importance Japan are to the Indo-Pacific. Japan, Australia and New Zealand are massively important for keeping an eye on what's going on with China and Taiwan, and for influence operations within the Indo-Pacific region. Right, I just thought I'd throw that one in. Right, let's go on to US news concerning Ukraine and Russia. The US Treasury has sanctioned Gazprom Bank and takes additional steps to curtail Russia's use of the international financial system. So Gazprom Bank, I think, is the third biggest bank in Russia. Is a really significant move, this, following Russia-based financial institutions and individuals are being designated pursuant to EO 14024 for operating or so on and so forth. You get the point there from the dead district. But actually, like I've said before, the American Treasury Department is doing an insanely important job. And if the new Trump administration comes in and lifts sanctions, I think that's the end of Ukraine, really. So adding Gazprom Bank to that and a load of other entities connected with it, I think is really good. A system for transfer of financial messages, Dozens of Russian banks are further curtailing Russia's connections to the international financial system. OFAC is designating more than 50 small to medium Russian banks to prevent Russia from abusing the international financial system to pay for the technology and equipment it needs to sustain its illegal and unjust war against Ukraine. Foreign financial institutions that maintain correspondent relationships with these banks should be aware that continuing to do so entails significant sanctions risks. So secondary sanctions if you end up working with all these entities. And you can see people here and banks and all sorts, dozens of Russian banks, but Gazprom Bank is the big one there. So the US doing an awful lot to curtail Russians' economic activities. Okay, now I thought this stuck out actually because I've not really heard this anywhere else. This is PS01, so take it with a pinch of salt. It seems to be coming from, I'm not sure what the news source is, but it is in Russian. Trump supported Biden's decision to grant permission to Ukraine to strike deep into Russia, according to the president of the Republican Club, Boris Pincus. Quote, Biden shared his plan and discussed it with Trump and got a positive response. In Trump's politics, the peace is based on force. This is interesting. So Trump may well have, implicitly at least, given Biden support for allowing ATACMS to be used deep inside Russia. And that might, if that's true, it should end the kind of MAGA Trumpian responses and criticisms for allowing Ukraine to do so. But I don't know the details there. Now, Ilya Ponomarenko, former Kyiv Independent journalist and author, has said, what's going on is Russia turning on the most desperately brain-dead propaganda and irrational fear-mongering by its assets to undermine an extremely belated decision to let Ukraine defend itself from extermination in war. There's what's going on. So this is in response to Tucker Carlson. So having just heard that maybe Trump was implicitly in support of the lifting of restrictions to use ATACMS further into Russia, Tucker Carlson, who is, for all intents and purposes, a Russian shill, Russian plant, said, a lame duck president just started a hot war with the world's most dangerous country. All of us are very close to being killed. Yet somehow the Republican Speaker of the House hasn't even mentioned it in public or in leadership meetings. What is going on? So this is actually a criticism, oddly, of Mike Johnson for not having capitalized on Biden lifting restrictions in a kind of critical way. And it could be because actually Trump knew about it. Anyway, as I keep saying, de-escalation requires the attacker to attack less, not the victim to defend less. Now, we move on to just a quick conversation about some of the picks still. I've talked a lot about Tulsi Gabbard, about not being clearly good enough or not even good enough. She's not good enough, but she's also completely wrong-headed as a choice for the director of the National Intelligence. Nikki Haley, the former presidential candidate for the GOP, has said that she slammed Trump's top intelligence pick, Tulsi Gabbard, calling her a Russian sympathizer. She blamed, as in Tulsi Gabbard, blamed NATO for the attack on Ukraine, and the Russians and the Chinese echoed her talking points and her interviews on Russian and Chinese TV, Nikki Haley said. So this is good. This is what I want to see. Reagan Republicans or more traditional Republicans standing up and saying these picks are not good enough. I'm going to do the video on 4 picks because I think the 4 most problematic picks are, all of them are problematic apart from really Marco Rubio's fairly normal. A couple of others, Mike Walls and a few others, but more and more, like going from Linda McMahon to all these people that are getting chosen are just totally wrong for the positions. But anyway, 4 main ones I think are truly problematic. Tulsi Gabbard is the worst. They're followed by Matt Gaetz for Attorney General and RFK Jr. for the HHS, I think is really problematic as well. And then Pete Hegseth for DOD. there are reasons I think those are properly problematic, not least morally speaking. Like, they didn't do their homework, they didn't do any investigations whether they're good enough. So Hegseth he's paid off a sexual abuser. So in a sexual abuse case, he's paid off the victim, it appears. And that was only 2017 as well. So that's not like when he was at uni or anything. So that's just a real worry. The McMahon's, that she's going for education, nominated for being in charge of the education department. She and her husband with the WWE have covered up sexual abuse, and that's a scandal that's going on. You're like, really? And then you've got Tulsi Gabbard, just full of controversy. Then you've got Matt Gaetz, and need I say more? It's just insane. You got RFK Jr. as well, sexual allegations in there too. These are the most insane picks. They're bad for every single reason: moral reasons, and also competence reasons, expertise reasons, and ideological reasons. So Tulsi Gabbard is just utterly the wrong person. But I've told you all that before. I'm going to do a separate video on that. So anyway, what's more to do with kind of international security is Trump has announced Matthew Whitaker as his nominee to be ambassador to NATO in Brussels. This is a guy that has absolutely no expertise in the relevant fields. Was he not a lawyer was involved in some aspect previously? Did he not stand in for Attorney General in Trump's previous tenure? But anyway, Matthew Whitaker is like, what are you doing? Like, Trump names Matthew Whitaker as next US ambassador. Whitaker served briefly as acting US Attorney General during Trump's first term. Yeah, that was it. Has no evident experience in national security, diplomacy, or foreign policy. It's bizarre. I was listening to Tim Miller talk about Matthew Whitaker. No, it's Tim Miller and JV Last and Sam Stein talk about them. And they were talking about this idea of accelerationism, which is a really interesting concept that if you are against the Trump administration, say you're a hardline Democrat, and you're like, oh my God, what do we do? So you've got two choices. You can either fight tooth and nail against the Republican Party and the Republican nominees, etc., or you can adopt an accelerationism stance. And accelerationism is this idea that actually if we let it all happen, you can even help it. You go for it. This is what you voted for as the electorate, and this is who you nominated, Trump. Let's go for it. Yeah, fair enough. I'm going to let that happen. You go for that, because we're going to accelerate the complete collapse of this administration, because it's full of people who are thoroughly incompetent. And then we go, I told you so, and now let's start again, but let's do it properly. So that's the accelerationism stance. I'm not advocating either of these. I'm just telling you that. But the idea, they were talking about Matthew Whitaker as being part of this accelerationist idea, because they were saying he is so unfit to be NATO ambassador that he just doesn't have the skills. All the other NATO countries will be like, yeah, the US really has gone down a pan, and they start then dismissing the US and not working so closely with the US, so that the US it all just starts falling apart, and it would add to that add to the expedition, if you like, of the collapse of respect for the US, for the administration, etc. That may or may not happen, or you get people working as well as possible with Matthew Whitaker, but he just does not appear to be the right guy for the job, as is the case across the board with pretty much everyone. Anyway, that's enough on this video for US kind of picks and whatnot. I'm going to go to Scott Ritter. I love that Ilya Ponomarenko loves this. I will retweet every time I see this. It never gets old. Scott Ritter saying on Twitter, and if you don't know Scott Ritter, I've done a few videos way back at the beginning of the war. He's a Russian shill who is an absolute disgrace to humanity. He says, "You're an American serving in the Ukrainian army. You're a traitor. You will reap a traitor's reward." And then you got community noted by those on Twitter, calling him out with, when you community note, then you put links to support, etc. Readers added context to this. Makiorowski, who is a person that Scott Ritter is taking aim at, is not a traitor, as America is not at war with Ukraine. Ritter is a twice convicted child sex offender. Just brilliant. Just going to add some context here. One, you're empirically wrong with what you're saying. And 2, just to remind the world, you're a twice convicted child sex offender. So, jog on. Go and cast your moral evaluations elsewhere, little man. Right, that's enough from me. Take care, everybody, and I will see you soon. Speak to you soon in yet another video. I want to do a mapping update tonight, but I don't know that I have time anymore, and it's long overdue. I keep leaving it like 2 or 3 days between mapping updates, so I'll try and get one done. Anyway, take care.